It's our weekly show about politics. I'm Marcos Molitzes. I am running solo today. For those of you who tuned in last week, heard last week's episode, Carrie Alavel, my typical co-host, our whole house had COVID. She was the lone holdout, and it seemed like she might pull through, but unfortunately, she did not. She finally tested positive yesterday. So, from all indications, she's doing fine. She's feeling a little run down, so she doesn't have any serious symptoms. But it does mean that I am running solo today. But on the plus side, we have a great guest. In fact, I'm going to bring her right in. Our guest today is Afton Bain. She is an organizer at ruralorganizing.org. We've had all sorts of people from ruralorganizing.org. They're a friend of the show, and we love what they do. Afton, so happy to have you here. Thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I'm so sorry Carrie's not feeling well, but I'm incredibly excited to be here.
So, Afton, last week we had this great show. We had Anderson Clayton. She's a North Carolina Democratic Party chair, and she came out of that rural organizing tradition, which obviously is your big focus. And I want to ask you a little bit about her in a little bit. But first, before I get to that, I'm sure people would love to know a little bit about you, who you are, how you what you do at ruralorganizing.org, and how you got into that line of work.
Yeah, I love it. So I have an unconventional background. I'm a social worker, but on the public policy side. And I was actually working in Europe when Trump was elected. And unlike a lot of my colleagues, decided to move back to East Tennessee, where I grew up.
After Trump was elected?
Yeah, after Trump was elected.
Oh my God!
Yes, right. Not quite the common route. And I remember taking my parents out to eat and telling them I want to get into Tennessee politics, and my mom started sobbing at the table, and she said, "You're never supposed to move back to godforsaken East Tennessee." And since then, it's been quite the trajectory. I started out as a Medicaid expansion organizer in 2017, and then, as you know, President Trump and the administration went after the Affordable Care Act. With all the iterations of ACA and all the federal bills. And so I was out in rural parts of Tennessee talking about the importance of federal healthcare legislation. And then in 2018, I was hired by Indivisible for the Tennessee U.S. Senate race, and I was the only statewide organizer in the state of Tennessee. I started the rural program at Indivisible, and then I was hired by ruralorganizing.org in November of 2021 ahead of midterms.
Yeah, man, how do you like it?
I love it. I love it. I mean, it's been quite the experience. And so I know you've had Matt Hildreth, who's our executive director. You've interviewed him a few times, but at RO, we really see ourselves as creating resources and providing technical assistance for rural organizers all across the country. We're a field and communications and policy organization. And we shift what people think about rural communities and rural voters, which I guess is what brings us here today. And a little side note, Anderson Clayton actually was led our 2020 exit interview project, where we interview rural organizers all across the country as to what went well, what didn't go so well in the 2020 election. And Anderson Clayton was actually part of that project. So excited to hear more about that.
Yeah, so there's a shared history that you guys know each other. She was on the show last week, and if you haven't caught the show, anybody listening, I highly encourage you catch that show. Anderson Clayton is a star in the making. Yes. She is the future of the Democratic Party. She's a president of the Democratic Party in North Carolina, but she is definitely a rising star. She's like 25. Yes. And she's running one of the largest state parties. And she did so because she made this incredible case that the existing party had really fallen flat in their efforts at organizing, particularly in rural areas, but it sounded like pretty much everywhere in North Carolina. It's actually pretty brutal. While Democrats made gains all across the board in a lot of purple battleground and even some red states, they actually went backwards in Tennessee, which was not Tennessee, in North Carolina, which is really not what anybody expected. So she's bringing new life, and she's bringing this sort of real focus on rural issues. And Afton, so you know her, right?
Yeah, we go way back. And so I think there's there's a new group of organizers, burgeoning organizers that have entered the national sphere and are really shedding light to the importance of rural organizing in rural communities, especially in some of these target states for 2024.
the sort of conventional wisdom in the Democratic Party for a long time has been that there was a sort of low hanging fruit with core base Democratic base voters, Black voters, Latinos, young people, college students, and so on. And there was a sense that, whew, rural, like we're getting our asses whooped, we can make it up in the cities and on college campuses. And and then the funny thing happened, particularly in 2016, is that Hillary Clinton outperformed her numbers, her targets in the cities and in the college campuses and with target groups. And she still lost the election because all these rural voters that nobody knew even existed came out of the woodworks, and Trump somehow activated them. And so this idea that it was just base Democratic voters that were turned off the politics sort of kind of got upended, that there was also a core conservative base group that had been so disaffected and they're so nihilist that they needed somebody like Donald Trump to activate them. So the issue is, so when you talk about rural organizing, you're not trying to win the rural vote, right? Like what is it that you're trying to accomplish?
Yeah, so I think Anderson spoke about this in her interview where she said states are won and lost on the margins, and I couldn't agree more. Rural engagement matters, hands down, and abortion will be the marginal issue in 2024, and I know we'll talk about that a little later. But there are about 30 million Democrats that live in rural America, and most of them are in hiding. And it's really important to note that the lack of rural visibility and the Democratic identity is bleeding these voters. And so the voters that didn't show up in 2016 are the voters that perhaps some of them showed up in 2018. A lot of them showed up for the abortion ballot measures in 2022. And so we're really interested in leveraging that rural engagement. And also, I know you've talked a lot about like the strategies moving forward and looking ahead to 2024, but Democrats really need a both and strategy. And so, as Anderson mentioned, appealing to the base first, making sure she talked a lot about rural engagement and organizing at HBCUs in areas that have been historically neglected. And then what you do is you appeal to other constituencies and you peel off those voters with issues such as abortion and democracy. And so I'm really excited to see those candidates that step into the national spotlight in 2024, as well as state party chairs like Ben Wickler and Anderson Clayton that really embrace that strategy and try to turn out in this most important election, perhaps of my lifetime.
They all are. It almost seems like a broken record, right? Like every election is the most important election, but they are. For a while, and as long as democracy is literally on the ballot, it will be the most important election because it could very well be the last election if Republicans have their way. That's right. And so it is absolutely critical. And obviously we can walk and chew gum, right? I don't think it's an either or situation. And I sense that there is a lot more interest in rural organizing than there was maybe 4 to 8 years ago. But that's from my outside vantage point. You're right in the middle of the fight. How are you sensing that?
Yeah, I like to say that I think rural organizing has become more of a sexy endeavor. Even though I kudos to Matt for founding this organization before 2016 and really elevating the need to embrace rural engagement and prioritize it. But I just want to give you a little bit of a thought experiment. We cannot write off red states, and rural organizing plays a pivotal role in that. 70% of the US population live in 15 states by 2040. So I'm just going to let that settle for your listeners. 70% of the US population will live in 15 states by 2040.
30 of 100 senators are going to be the tiny percentage left everywhere else. It's going to...
Yes. So rural voters will have a massive impact on the Senate and the Supreme Court. And unless we abolish the Senate, which I know there are organizations actively working on that, we're not going to get rid of this problem, right? And so, in recent years, Republicans have focused on consolidating these voters in red states and rural areas, which is why progressive rural organizing has been so pivotal. And I want to give an example. In 2018, I was the statewide organizer in Tennessee for the U.S. Senate race with Phil Bredesen and Marsha Blackburn. I'm so sorry. And after 2018, when we lost that race by double digits, Tennessee was written off the national map, right? And I saw a lot of national donors say, well, Tennessee's not worth investing in.
And to be clear, Phil Bredesen was a former or current governor. Like you could not find a better candidate, somebody who had won statewide. And I don't think it was even that close in the end.
No, it wasn't. It was 11 points. And I saw the same sentiment in 2022 after Iowa and Ohio lost their Senate races. And so as I'm hearing, I've grown, I've been professionalized in red state organizing, right? Deep, Appalachian, Southern, rural organizing. And we just can't write off these states, right? Because if we seed states like Ohio, right, which has been a battleground state and in perpetuity, if we seed states like this, we will never get them back. And so I just want to reiterate how critical it is that we invest in rural and red organizing ahead of 2024, but in the next decade, because this issue will not go away. There will just be more voters consolidated in fewer states, and we'll still have to play the Senate map. So.
Yeah, and then even in 2024, we have to defend Ohio with Sherrod
Yes.
Brown. We have to defend John Tester in Montana. We have to defend Joe Manchin in West Virginia. And yeah, Joe Manchin, right? But Joe Manchin was the reason we had the Senate last time. And so,
Right.
he kind of is a necessary evil. There's nothing else on the map. I mean, our two best pickup opportunities are Texas and Florida, and that's rough.
Yeah.
So the rest of the map is basically rural states, and that's sort of the reality. And as you say, if we have a situation where 60 senators come from rural states, we are in trouble. Now, I will say this. It's easier to be for rural organizing when the issues now overlap with what's important with urban liberals. Once upon a time, it was like, okay, to appeal to a rural voter, you had to be squishy on abortion. You had to be, you had to be anti-welfare. You had to be there's like a certain appeal towards conservative ideology in order to like be competitive. I don't know if that was ever really the right approach. That's beyond my area expertise, but that was sort of the conventional wisdom. So anytime somebody said we have to appeal to rural voters, that meant you had to kick urban democratic priorities in the face. Now you have a situation where, if it wasn't always the case, it has evolved in that direction. And I'm going to read this passage from a political story that ran today on Wisconsin's the Wisconsin Supreme Court race a couple of months ago, the one where in the most 50-50 state in the country, Democrats won the Wisconsin Supreme Court race by 11 points in the middle of like the spring, where these races are scheduled that way to lower voter turnout.
Right.
The previous Supreme Court race had 800,000 voters. 1.8 million voters turned out for this one. And the Wisconsin party chair, Ben Wickler, who is an old friend of mine and who is sort of transforming what it means to be a state party chair. And I know Anderson Clayton talked about him as sort of as a model to emulate. Yes. And he was asked, he talked about the how they didn't expect the big turnout. It happened anyway. How abortion was sort of like the big driver. And he was asked what the most surprising thing about the victory was. And he said that abortion was the main vote driver for the Democratic Supreme Court candidate in every market in the state. He says it wasn't just an issue that was working for Democrats in big cities, but it actually worked in rural areas too. You earlier mentioned abortion for one, and you also mentioned democracy. And Carrie and I have, going back from the beginning of this podcast, like 3 years, we have always said that the issues of democracy and issues of abortion were going to radically transform the electoral landscape. Yes. And it did so in 2022 for sure. I didn't realize, though, that this is having salience in rural areas. So what are you seeing? And do you agree with Ben Wickler that this is actually a thing that is motivating rural voters towards the Democratic Party?
Yeah. So, I mean, I grew up in East Tennessee, and I was always taught never to talk about sex, politics, and religion and abortion. And I think that for a long time, that was embraced by the DC punditry class, right? Like, especially if you're running in the South, you absolutely want to refrain from talking about abortion. However, in these past few years, unconventionally, we have been proven otherwise. And so I want to give, a nod to abortion's track record in terms of statewide ballot referendums, 6 out of 6 in 2022, including Kentucky, in Kansas. And what we heard from the field were that these counties, so for example, in Kansas, Franklin County, which Trump won by over 40 points in the 2020 election, voted no by more than 13, right?
No, Garen, no against restrictions.
Yes, correct.
So they
right.
voted to protect abortion rights.
Progressive option, right? And so what we're seeing, I mean, amazingly, that's almost a 50-point vote difference, right? And so abortion does have a track record, and I just want to flag also. I mean, so here I am, elated that one, I can finally talk about abortion in the South, stores, right? And like really, right, and untraditional voters that aren't really motivated by the type of organizing maybe from the Democratic Party, right, but really care about these issues. And I just want to pause. Your voters are going to get such a kick out of this because I nearly died. So as I'm reviewing all the post 2022 election analysis, Susan B. Anthony's list, so the premier pro-birth PAC endorsement, led by Marjorie Dannenfelser, said that the reason Republicans, there wasn't a red tsunami, was that Republicans didn't lean into anti-abortion enough. And I'm like, no, I had to reread it. And sure enough, I mean, they really believe that this is the way forward, right? And unfortunately, Republicans have backed themselves into a corner because there is really no nuance when it comes to federal abortion bans and these, Republican supermajorities banning abortion. There's no nuance when it comes to that. And so I think Republicans have really, they are really going to struggle next year when abortion is such a popular issue.
I mean, the supposed talking points was they were going to return it to the states. And then now they're talking like, well, maybe we can, voters they're okay with 16 weeks. They're okay with 14 weeks. They're okay with, if you've spent 50 years saying abortion is murder, are you going to then say like, murder's fine for 15 weeks?
That's right.
And murder is fine in California, just not in Texas. I mean, they literally backed themselves in the corner, and there's no way for them to message moderation and electoral expediency or strategy, because they worked in the absolutes and their people don't know how to think outside of those absolutes. And it's absolutely amazing. So they keep saying, and a lot of the punditry, a lot of white men too in the punditry keep saying like, oh, this issue will lose its salience. Like people will move on to other issues. Oh, they'll want to talk about inflation. They'll want to talk about crime. Do you see any of that? Like, I don't see.
Well, I want to say, in 2022, I'm over here in my post-election analysis, like spotlight, just being like, yes, we said all these things. Because Democrats that, as I said, embraced a both and strategy, so motivated the base, peeled off voters with, issues like abortion. But despite the call for Democrats to focus solely on inflation and jobs, candidates who also focus on abortion and protecting democracy made gains with rural voters, right? So, I mean, I do think it's going to be obviously at the forefront, inflation, jobs, crime, etc. But you have a whole swath of voters who are ready to go and gearing up to vote in 2024 that may not be motivated by those issues. Another platform of ours that I wanted to elevate, a big thank you to Carrie, who couldn't make it today, but she actually wrote an article that highlighted one of our polls that we ran last year. And I think your listeners will find this just fascinating. So even in rural America, supporting abortion rights definitively helped Democratic candidates this cycle, which we said, right? But this was the kicker. So a rural candidate that received a pro-choice organization endorsement fared better than a rural candidate that received an endorsement from the Farm Bureau.
Oh my God.
Right? I mean,
the Farm Bureau is like the king of everything, right?
Rural king, right? Yeah, rural king. But that is how important rural voters have embraced the issue of abortion, especially in these Trump counties, right? That like maybe, I was speaking to an organization in Cookeville, Tennessee, rural area I used to organize in, that have this grassroots abortion group, right? And they were talking about, I'm like, what is political what does a political win look like for you when you have no Democrats at the municipal level, you have no Democrats at the state level, and you have no Democrats at the federal level? And they said abortion is one of those issues, if Tennessee were to be able to pass ballot referendums, that they can voice their opinion on. And I think we're seeing that across the country. And don't even get me started on Ohio. I don't know if you want to talk about what's going on there in terms of the abortion fight, but oh my gosh, my head is spinning.
And it's also interesting that a pro-choice organization would carry that much weight in rural America, because conservative has spent the last 50 years literally demonizing NARAL and Emily's List and all these groups that are working towards abortion rights.
Right.
They've gotten the sort of the Hillary Clinton, all liberals are evil, they're baby killers, and for them to still have not just not be dismissed, but to actually be embraced on those issues is an incredible shift. So the question then becomes, we always talk about the sort of the Democratic Party brand. And in that Politico piece on the Wisconsin race, Republicans were complaining about their party brand, and abortion is a reason that they're crashing and burning. But that wasn't the presidential year election. And so I just want to make clear that 11 points in the middle of the spring in a odd number year does not indicate that we're out of the woods in Wisconsin. It's going to be a real fight next year. But how do we take that next step? You talk about how many the outsized importance of rural states in the U.S. Senate for our politics in general. We need to, the first step obviously is not to lose, just get 15% of the vote in rural areas. Maybe we get up to 30, make it 70-30. What does it take to then make that step so we're actually winning 50+1? And I know we're going to be looking out ahead, right? But I hope you guys are thinking ahead. And I don't understand. This is the part I don't understand. How does somebody say, yeah, I'm for abortion rights. I may be for democracy, but those Democrats are bad, right? And, if you go issue by issue by issue, right, they're kind of, I don't know, how many issues do you see that are core Democratic plank issues that do not work well with rural voters? Actually, that's a question.
That is a question. I mean, overwhelmingly, rural voters support economic populism. They support anti-corruption, anti-greed policies. They support progressive policies, which is why, and I'm sure you've had organizers that have been organizing for these ballot measures, that Republicans are trying to limit the number of states or increase the number of signatures required or increase the threshold passage, right? Because they can't win. They know that these policies are incredibly popular. And when put to a vote, a popular vote, we win hands down. Abortion 6 out of 6, right? I also want to draw attention, and I've canvassed in the most rural parts of a deeply conservative state, Tennessee. We call it the buckle of the Bible Belt.
Actually, you got to write that book, by the way.
My memoir, Bible of the Buckle, the Bible of the Buckle of the Belt. But I canvassing in these very conservative evangelical parts of the state, talking about abortion, talking about immigration, right? And there's such a plurality to voters in this country, right? Like, I met so many people who loved, the immigrants who opened up the rural Mexican restaurant in their hometown, and they were caring for them, and they were fighting for their child to receive in-state scholarship to the public university, right? But then they voted for Marsha Blackburn. And I think it's when in electoral politics, right? It's a win is a win, and you determine your success by the electoral outcomes. But I think in states that are, especially rural and red, there's just this pluralism of a voter that I think isn't often elevated. And I think abortion is just one of those issues that allows that kind of complexity to be disentangled. And when you get to the core of the issue, it's about choice, freedom, and democracy, right? Which are so intertwined.
So how do you finish that process? How do you continue to disentangle the sort of ingrained hatred for the Democratic Party with the policies that party supports? And I don't know, I assume there's issues of class, there's issues of racism, there's issues of alienation from being cut out from the prosperity of the big cities. I mean, these are all sort of issues that I know we've talked about in the show before, but I'm curious, since you are literally on the ground talking to these people, what is it that holds them back from saying, like, yeah, fuck it, I'm gonna vote Democratic this time?
Honestly, I mean, it's a web of, I would say, disinformation. I would also say, I mean, what I brought this up earlier in the conversation, but that visibility is a huge issue when it comes to Democrats and progressives in rural America, right? And without that visibility, you feel isolated. You feel like your vote doesn't matter, right? And so I think, especially as we see this rural revitalization and renaissance of millennials my age moving back to their hometowns after they've, lots of brain drain, as we call it in Appalachia, where millennials who've graduated college move out, but now they're coming back and they're restoring Main Street, right? Businesses, and bringing back breweries to their hometowns. And I think that there's a constituency there that is deeply untapped. Are we going to persuade the most MAGA rural county chairperson? No, like we're not, right? Are we going to persuade my QAnon grandmother? Absolutely not, right? We're not going to do that. But are there people in rural communities that can be validators? And in rural organizing, we say the messengers matter more than the message, right? And I think if we can foment some belonging and rural representation ahead of 2024, and we bring progressives and Democrats out of the woodwork, that they'll say, you know what, my vote does matter, and I see that it matters a lot more when I've got 20 of my community members with me.
And is that millennial revitalization, is that because of work from home policies and post pandemic? Is that what's happening?
Yes. There's a lot to that. And I think there's also, I obviously moved back in 2016 when Trump was elected, but I have a lot of friends who are now starting families and moving back to Tennessee, and they're voting, right? They're voting in mass. And so I do hope, I do think states like Tennessee that have lacked national investment and national attention, which I don't know if you wanted to talk about the Tennessee 3 protests, but I was on the ground organizing those. And I think that when you have a state like North Carolina, as Anderson discussed, and Tennessee that is thrown into the national spotlight, I think it's a moment of opportunity to say, hey, red states deserve investment, they deserve attention, they deserve infrastructure, and I think that's where, at least like Anderson and I, that's our our core value, is that we deeply believe in the good of our states and for change to come.
I do want to talk about the Nashville 3, but before that, I'm just really sort of so what you're saying, if these millennials move into back to their small towns, they open up their gluten-free coffee shop and a yoga studio, that we're on the right track? Is that what's happening?
Yeah.
Is that literally a thing that's happening?
Yeah, it is. I mean, I would say not enough nationally studies to corroborate it, but I will say anecdotally, I see this in Appalachia, where I'm from. I've seen this in more blue states. So there's a lot of millennials that are moving back to their rural areas in Colorado and Minnesota, right? So you're seeing these states even become more blue. So I do think this is a phenomenon. I'm just wondering, in the next 10 years, especially with that demographic and targeting shift, with all these people moving back or moving to these urban core states, right? Then what does that look like for the map? And I do think there's a lot of hope in organizing that exact type of constituency.
Yeah, that's fascinating, because Lauren Boebert in Colorado, in her very rural, very deeply red state, almost lost.
Yes.
Almost lost. And so, yeah, you're seeing hints of it. You're not seeing, it's not overwhelming yet, but you're seeing hints of that as well. Tell me a little bit about the Nashville 3. We saw that two of the legislators, the two black ones, were kicked out by Republicans for anti-abortion.
Gun control.
It was gun control, yes. The white woman was not, because and she was very clear about the reason why not, and that's because she was the white one of the three. Gun control, first of all, that protest itself, how does that play in rural Tennessee? And even the issue of gun control, now that you bring it up, because that's another key plank that has hurt Democrats in rural areas. But I'm starting to get a sense that's softening, but that could be wishful thinking. What do you see?
No, so as a statewide organizer, this was the first time that I will say so many organizers from across the state came together those 3 weeks. I think when we debriefed, we counted over 17 direct actions in 2 weeks. I mean, but we came together, and what was beautiful is that there was this rural urban solidarity in a moment of authoritarianism, right? And I mean, it was truly something to behold. Like there were urban groups that were fundraising so that we could organize cars and drives for rural organizers to come up to the state. I don't know if you saw, and then I'll send you the link afterwards, but And I didn't know this was happening because I was, we had levels of security. So I didn't know this was happening. But during one of the protests, rural organizers unfurled a banner that said rural Tennessee against fascist GOP, right?
Okay.
And it was like, I'm getting goosebumps talking about it because it was just, in a state like Tennessee, we are living and breathing authoritarianism, right? And here's a path to building that multiracial democracy, which it is the solidarity between rural and urban organizers. And I think it's also really important to note because someone asked me like, well, it seems it's, they're expelling urban legislators, right? But despite the overrepresentation of these rural legislators in the state ledge, rural communities are suffering in Tennessee just as much as our urban cores, right? Like our standard of living hasn't improved. They're withholding all this money to support working families, which disproportionately impacts rural communities. And so just to say that it was just this beautiful moment of someone who, I've organized across the state in rural communities. I also live in East Nashville now. And it was, the solidarity bred opportunity in a way. And it was just the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. So just shout out to all the organizers and all the rural folks that, stopped working for 2 weeks so that they could help us organize all these protests. But it really was a microcosm of this rural urban conflict that we see so much in our politics today.
I mean, it was a national phenomenon, and it was amazing. And I actually do think that sort of harkens back to something I mentioned earlier, that it was a lot harder to sit there and say, like, let's organize rural communities when we were told that we had to have a completely different message for those rural communities. The fact that now that we have a broader message about freedom that resonates in both places allows us for a more genuine building of the Democratic Party brand, right? Because it's not somebody in rural saying like, well, you're telling me that abortion's icky and that we should minimize it, but then look at so-and-so who's all for unfettered abortion. And having the ability to have one message that resonates, that is a core sort of American message, really puts us in a much better place than we've ever been. And I think that's what gives me hope, that as long as that message does resonate, and you're telling me it does resonate in those rural communities, that we can start chipping away and eroding. You add on demographic changes, you add on millennials, younger people moving back to those rural communities and starting their families there. Not just because of the vote they bring, but also the message and the values they project, right? There was a story today in the Washington Post about Christian homeschooling and how this one family had sort of escaped, like decided to put their kids in public schools from that sort of Christianist and the hate that they got, right? But it sort of infiltrates it, right? Because one person in the community put their kids in school and they didn't turn to Satan. Like, maybe they're okay. And it sort of starts undermining that closed bubble that they've created with Fox News and Tucker Carlson and, Sean Hannity and AM radio. And so it does. I mean, it's a long-term project, right? But
yes,
but it finally makes me think like, okay, I don't have to compromise my principles as a coastal elite, urban, Latino, liberal in order to talk to somebody like Afton Bain in rural Kentucky. We're talking the same language now. I didn't see anything in what we've said that there's no daylight between the values that we believe in that I can tell.
Yeah, no, that's so true. And I just want to harken back to something that Anderson said in terms of, I think you're talking about, Christian supremism in the South. And, she said the Democratic Party needs to return to service, right? It needs to return to its service roots. And I think, watching the church organize in the South and seeing the erosion on, not just the left, but by younger constituencies of the church and that erosion of the social fabric, like how are we rebuilding that, right? How are we recultivating that cultural and social fabric of service and supporting each other in moments of a hardship? And I know Democrats love to say this in Tennessee, but when an issue hits, right, when there's a crisis, no one's asking if you're a Democrat or a Republican, right? You're a community member and you're involved. Yeah. And I just think that, and this is, one of our pride and joys in rural organizing in terms of our organizing platform is local, right? And I think when you have local messengers, when you're organizing in off years around local issues, right? That you're able to build that brand, you're able to build that reputation in a way that inevitably and eventually inoculates against the hyper nationalization of our politics, right? Because it'll never cease to amaze me when I'm out canvassing in rural parts of the state, for a county commission race, and someone's asking me about a Supreme Court decision, right? And I'm like, how is that? Well, when you live in this this information ecosystem of Fox News, right? And no one's really having another narrative, right? That consumes your psyche. That consumes everything you're talking about. But when someone comes up and says, "Hey, we've canvassed your area. We heard that water's an issue here. Can you talk a little bit more about that?" And immediately kind of depletes that defensive guard and allows you to access a point of conversation that you might not normally not get to access earlier. And Anderson also made the point, like talking about insulin, right? And someone asked, well, is Joe Biden going to tax insulin or the Affordable Connectivity Program, which Anderson and I, rural broadband is our first love, second love, rural organizing.
You need those millennials moving back in. You need that broadband to kick them butt, right?
Yeah, that's right.
You have that without the broadband.
But how can we incorporate, the benefits of this federal government, direct service, and leveraging local issues and local messengers? And I think that's the winning strategy right now and in the future.
Yeah, and in the past, you had local newspapers too that would actually provide some of that local issues coverage that would give you a hook to. That wasn't, but that's all been decimated, obviously, with the rest of the news industry. And Facebook, which at one point provided some local news, has been subsumed by QAnon conspiracy theories. And so, absolutely. So, after that's our time. I want to give you an opportunity to.
Wow, I had so much fun.
I know. I was like, whoa, so I want to give you an opportunity to pitch what you guys are doing or what people can do to help your efforts.
Yeah, sure. So we didn't even get to talk about Ohio, but
you'll have to come back.
Okay, yeah, I'll come back. But right now, ruralorganizing.org, we're running a field in Ohio. For those of you who haven't been following, those of your listeners, the Republicans in Ohio are fighting to ensure that abortion isn't on the ballot in November. So they've forced an election in August so that they can increase the passage threshold of the abortion ballot in November. So just like shenanigans everywhere, right? And so right now we're engaged in talking to rural voters in small towns, helping local groups talk to their communities about abortion and about democracy in Ohio. We've just revamped our website, so check it out, www.ruralorganizing.org. And we're so grateful, for Daily Kos for bringing the issue of rural organizing to the forefront so that your listeners can get a taste of what my day-to-day looks like and how we're taking back power in rural America.
All right, I'm going to cheat a little bit. I need to know what people are saying in rural Ohio about the this ballot initiative to make ballot initiatives harder.
It's a mess. I will just say that it's a mess. So we're still fine tuning our communications, but I will say that Ohio voters don't like feeling taken advantage of. That's what they feel that the Republicans are doing right now.
That's the message. Okay. Thanks so much, Afton Bain. She's with ruralorganizing.org. Thank you so much for your time. We are going to have you back because this was way too much fun. Like I just want to say I do appreciate your energy and your commitment to this fight and this idea that millennials are coming back to rural areas. That actually gives me hope because you know what? We have enough millennials in San Francisco and New York. Like let's bleed some of that out to places where politically they can transform their local communities into something that actually moves the country forward, as opposed to leaving the Idahos and the Dakotas to Tennessee. Regressive dinosaurs who have way too much political power and are doing everything they can to drag us back into the dark ages. So I really appreciate your work and your energy, and thank you so much for what you do.
Yeah, thank you so much. All right, we'll see you next time.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye.
So, man, I love this so much. If you really see these two episodes back to back with last week with Anderson Clayton, the North Carolina Democratic Party chief, and today with Afton Bain, you start to see this like young millennial aggressive push towards bringing rural America back into some kind of modern America, right? Like, out of that Fox News bubble that is keeping them back, that is dragging them back to an America that really we don't want to go back to. And I really want to underscore just the importance of having that unified message. For those of us who have been working in politics for decades, for several decades, it really was a two-message strategy. So you're supposed to talk to urban voters one way and rural voters another way, and they called it micro-targeting. And this was all the rage during the Clinton years, particularly, and micro-targeting was supposed to be the way that the Democratic Party would be viable nationally. In fact, it made things worse because you had Democrats talking from both sides of their mouth. Nobody trusted what they had to say. It was clearly not a party that really knew what it stood for, because it basically stood for whatever it needed to say to win a particular voter. And it had no core, it had no heart, it had no soul. And now we have a party that really has started to find its footing. I know Carrie and I have been talking. Carrie's really been harping on the theme of liberty. Republicans have surrendered that theme. They used to be the party of liberty, and now they're about book burning and telling college professors what to say and what to think, and telling corporations what they can or cannot do. I mean, it really has turned on its head, and this weird conservative tirade against woke, which really means anything they don't like, has upended this notion of freedom. They've surrendered it completely, and Democrats have walked into that breach. Joe Biden's his first words in his announcement for re-election was freedom. And so I don't think rural America has ever surrendered the idea of freedom. That they want to be the rugged individualists, and we can point out all the ways that they're not. I mean, rural broadband is subsidized by urban America. But aside from that, the fact is they want to see themselves as independent, and they want to see themselves as free. And as Democrats adopt the mantle of freedom, and as Republicans explicitly reject it, it does give us an opportunity. So I'm so energized and pumped having done these two episodes, both last week's with Anderson Clayton and this week's with Afton Bain. So thank you so much for being part of that and joining us. And thank you so much for being part of this movement to save our democracy from reactionary Republicans. So I'd like to thank you, everybody who's listening, who's on Daily Kos, who reads Daily Kos, who is part of this movement. I'd like to thank Walter for producing the show, Paul for helping behind the scenes, Carrie for lining up these two guests. I know she couldn't make it today, and it breaks my heart because she would have loved this guest, but she made this episode happen. And so love you all. Thanks so much for everything, and I will catch you next week. Tell people about us, let everybody know to join this movement. Thanks so much.